Hey guys, it's Sarah. Today's video is going to be an updated ranking of all my eyeshadow palettes. I believe this video idea was originally started by Kelsey Brianna J here on YouTube, and then quite a few people have done the same. I actually did my first version of this last year, pretty much exactly a year ago. I think it was like in the spring of last year, and so my palette collection has changed and grown quite a bit since then. I think at the time I had 8 palettes. Since then I decluttered 1 and now I have 12. So my palette collection is quite different. A lot of the palettes that I talked about last year I do still own, but I have quite a few new ones that have taken over as favorites. Just like last year, I made up kind of a ranking system for this to kind of standardize the process of ranking them, because I felt like I couldn't just look at all these palettes and decide without having some sort of like criteria for ranking them. So I came up with 5 different criteria to rank each palette from 1 to 5, and then I added up the score there to come up with its total score. So those were color story and cohesiveness. So how much do I like the color story, and how easy is it for me to look at the palette and come up with a cohesive look. These are all very subjective, of course, because I'm just ranking them based on my own personal preference, but it just was there to kind of help me organize my rankings a little bit better. Quality, so things like pigmentation, blendability, fallout. Variety, how much variety is there within the palette? How many different types of looks can I come up with? Inspiration, how inspired do I feel when I look at the palette? And finally, packaging, just how practical and how high quality is the packaging. So for those 5 categories, I ranked each palette on a scale of 1 to 5. The highest score a palette could get was 25, and then from there I ranked them based on their total scores. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started, and I'm gonna rank them from my least favorite to my favorite. My least favorite, my number 12 out of 12, was the Profusion Spectrum palette. This is a very inexpensive palette. It's like a $5 palette. You get 10 colors. And the reason why this scored the lowest was just because it's the one that I reach for the least. I don't really tend to gravitate towards these bright rainbow colors, and this is really just kind of like a supplemental palette to my collection in case I ever do want a pop of color. But it's not a palette where I could just grab it and create a look out of it using just these colors. I mean, I could, but it's just not really my makeup taste. I think the quality is perfectly fine for what an inexpensive palette this is. Most of the shades, you do have to kind of build them. They're not, you know, super pigmented right off the bat, which can be nice if you're new to color and you just want, you know, colors that are easy to work with. I do think they're nice, but I don't think the quality is outstanding. So that's why this one scored the lowest. I've actually thought about decluttering this a few times just because I'm just not really into these really bright colors. I don't wear them very often, but it's kind of nice to at least know that I have them in case I ever did want to use them, and a lot of these are colors that I really don't have anywhere else in my collection. So it's not a bad palette. I think it's great, especially if you want like a supplemental rainbow palette in your collection and you don't have one and you don't want to spend a lot of money because you know you probably won't use it very much. I don't think it's bad by any means, but just based on my own personal preferences, that's why it scored the lowest for me. Number 11, this is another drugstore palette, and again, I don't think it's a bad palette by any means, but it's the Milani Bold Obsessions palette. This is a neutral palette. In terms of color story and just the cohesiveness, I really like the way it's laid out. You have kind of a neutral row, a warm toned row, and a cool toned row. It does though have a few dud shades. I'm really not a fan of this shade Smoke Signals here. In the pan it looks almost like a denim blue gray color, but on the eyes it just looks like a dark gray. This taupe shade here it's kind of dry, kind of sheer. I kind of just wanted more from that shade. I really do like these 2 shimmers here, and the copper shade is really pretty and buttery, but the gold is very flaky and kind of dry. So some of the shades are not as top-notch quality as I feel like they could be, but for like an on-the-go travel palette, I do feel like it has everything I need in terms of neutral shadows. So I still like it. It's just not my favorite, and I don't find myself feeling super inspired by it. Okay, so number 10 is actually a high-end palette. This is the Anastasia Norvina palette. I do like this palette, and it really has grown on me since I first bought it. At first, I really didn't like it. However, right now, it is so messy. Do you see that? I think that happened during the move. I really do like the rosy tones in here. I do feel like some of the shades clash a little bit. Sometimes when I wear this palette, I feel like it makes me look like I have a black eye. Another thing though that I don't like about it is that the metallics are extremely flaky and have a ton of fallout. This palette is probably the worst in terms of fallout in my collection, which doesn't always bother me, but I usually do need to make a point to do my eyeshadow before my foundation and everything when I use this. It also helps to use like a glitter glue or a really tacky primer when you're using these glitters. But I have come up with some looks that I really do like out of this palette. The flakiness of those metallics is the main thing that kind of bothers me with this palette. Number 9 is the palette that I've had the longest. This is the oldest palette in my collection. I think I bought this in 2016, I believe, summer of 2016, so I've had it almost 4 years. This is the theBalm Nude Dude palette. I really do love this palette. It's a very neutral palette though, and there are some shades in here that I don't love the quality of. I don't really like these sort of murky dark shades. It's not that I don't like having some dark shades in palettes, but I feel like Fierce and Fine can just look kind of bleh, like they don't offer very much. The reason why it did get a little bit of a lower score is just because I feel like there's not a ton of variety here. I do love some of these shades, but I just don't feel super inspired by this palette. I actually have other neutral palettes that I am more inspired by, but I feel like I still love this palette. It still has a very special place in my collection, and I do really like that it's kind of a cooler neutral palette. It's so hard for me to rank these because I really do love all of these palettes. There's a reason why they are still in my collection. I try to keep a very curated collection, so keep in mind that none of these are ones that I've decided to declutter. Yeah, so this was very hard because this is a palette that I love, and so it's hard for me to say that this ranked number 8. But number 8 is my Anastasia Subculture palette. This one, okay, so the main reason why I love this palette is because it really inspires me, and I just think this is such a fun, unique, and just rich color story. The reason why it ranked a little bit lower is just because the quality of some of these shadows is not great. A lot of people had quality complaints on this palette. Mainly the shimmers. For me, I don't know, I must have gotten the batch where the shimmers are not good. Some people have told me that their shimmers are amazing, so I don't know. But all 3 of the shimmers in here, Cube, Electric, and Adorn, are just very, it's very hard to pick up any of that shadow on your brush or even on your finger. They sort of feel like they're like hard panned, but I can't really seem to get rid of that. And they've been like that ever since I got it, so it's not that this has just gotten old. I just think that those shimmers could be way better, especially knowing that Anastasia is capable of making really good shimmers. So those are the shades that get on my nerves. All the mattes are super pigmented, but you do have to be careful because they're almost like pressed pigments, and so they can go on kind of patchy and they're not as easy to blend as some of the mattes in other Anastasia palettes, but they are so rich and beautiful, and I love the color story. I love this dark teal axis. I love the forest green. I love the shade Electric. I just wish that it performed better. But yeah, it's just such a beautiful color story. So I love this palette, but just the quality is kind of the reason why it didn't rank any higher than it did. Number 7 is probably the second oldest palette that I own. This also used to be one of my top favorite palettes, but it's the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette. I don't feel like I've had any issues with mine, even though it is going on 3 years old, I think. When did I buy this? Bought this in like fall 2017. So it's been like 2.5 years. I don't feel like the quality has changed really for me. Lately, I just haven't been feeling quite as inspired by this as I used to. I think I've just been gravitating more towards cool tones recently, and not so much towards these reds and warm tones, although I do still love it. This is the palette that really got me into Anastasia eyeshadow palettes. Nowadays, I'm really not nearly as into them as I used to be. I feel like the brand just isn't as intentional with their releases as they used to be. There's also not a ton of variety here. I mean, there's a lot of very similar types of shades. They're all pretty much in the same color family, just kind of neutrals and these warm cranberries. So you kind of have to be in the mood for that type of look to want to reach for this palette. I do really love this palette, and I really can't see myself ever decluttering it, honestly, because it just, I just think it's a special palette. Okay, so we're getting into the top 6, the top half. Number 6 is another drugstore palette. This is the e.l.f. Opposites Attract. I do love this palette. It's just, out of all the e.l.f. palettes, this is my least favorite color story, it just doesn't inspire me nearly as much as the others. I do feel like the color story here is kind of all over the place, which is nice because you get a little bit of everything. You get some really nice warm tones, some peaches, greens, some purples, just there's all kinds of colors in here. I like how half of it is warm and half of it is cool, and there's a ton of variety here. But as far as how much it inspires me, I feel like these shades do lean just a little bit deep and smoky for my personal preferences and just my skin tone, but I do still think it's a beautiful palette. The quality is amazing, but just of my three e.l.f. palettes, this one would have to be my least favorite. Number 5 is also from Anastasia. This is their Soft Glam palette. This is the last Anastasia palette that I have to talk about today. This one is kind of just a warm, neutral palette. I really do love this palette. The quality is fantastic. I guess you could say that this is my favorite. I guess, well, given that it ranked the highest out of all my ABH palettes, I guess it is my favorite Anastasia palette. There really are very few, if any, dud shades in here. The only one that may be a little bit of a dud to me is Sultry, just because it is kind of chunky and flaky, but other than that, I mean, just top notch. Like, this is the quality that I expect from Anastasia. I do feel like even for a neutral palette, you do get a good bit of variety here, so I do love this palette. It's a good one. Okay, so we're getting down to the last few now. This is number 4. You may even be able to start guessing which palettes are going to be left in the rankings, but this is a newer palette to me and I really, really like it. This is the Shared Planet Polar Bear palette. The only thing I don't love about it is just that these shimmers, they're beautiful shimmers, but they are really best applied with a finger, and I do just kind of wish they were a little bit more buttery and soft to where you could apply them with a brush, because I know I personally do prefer using brushes over my fingers, and I know a lot of people do. I'm fine with using my fingers, but that is just kind of the one thing. But other than that, I like the matte to shimmer ratio. I am a big fan of shimmers over mattes, and so I like that you're just getting 4 basic mattes and then 8 really nice, very kind of metallic shimmers. I love that it leans cool, but you still have some warmer tones in here. Some really pretty blues to play with. I just think this is such a fun palette from a kind of lesser known brand, and a brand that I feel like deserves to be known about because it is a really cool company with a really cool mission behind it, and also the packaging is really nice and sturdy and just pretty. So love that one. This is one that I discovered just within the last few months. All right, top 3. Okay, so number 3 is actually the one I'm wearing on my eyes right now. So maybe you can guess what it is. It is from e.l.f. This is the New Classics palette. This is like the ultimate neutral palette. You'll notice that this one did rank even higher than my Anastasia Soft Glam palette. I feel like the quality is just as good, maybe a little bit less powdery than Anastasia. Anastasia shadows are very powdery, which is not always a bad thing. It kind of just means that there's a lot of color payoff, but these have a good color payoff without being powdery, so I almost prefer using these over Anastasia shadows. I've heard people actually say that this is like a dupe for the Soft Glam palette. I would actually disagree with that because A, there's a lot more shades here. I almost think that this is kind of a cross between Soft Glam and Sultry from Anastasia. You're kind of getting both the warm and the cooler tones here. Today I'm wearing, let's see, I'm wearing Platinum all over my lid. I'm wearing Uptown in the crease. I deepened up the outer corner with Earth. And then I did a little bit of winged liner on the upper lash line with Noir. And then I used Blanc in the inner corner and Creme on the brow bone. I will say these e.l.f. palettes scored a little bit lower in terms of packaging, just because I do feel like the packaging is kind of cheap. This one actually has cracked a little bit. It still latches shut, but I feel like it doesn't close as securely as it used to, so that's the only thing. I do like that they just left out a brush. I feel like palettes, unless you're gonna put a really good brush in there, I'd prefer the brands just leave it out. And there is no mirror, which I don't really mind, but that is one thing. It's just a little bit cheaper packaging, but I like how they fit 18 shades in these while still making it pretty small and compact. So I did give this a 4.5 out of 5 for quality, and I think the reason for that was that there's just a couple of shades that I'm not a huge fan of. I don't really like this Black Cherry shade. I don't tend to like those shades that are like that. It kind of just looks brown on the eyes, even though it really is yeah, you can see it when I swatch it. It's just, it looks like a really nice deep eggplant in the pan, but then when you swatch it, it just looks brown. So that's kind of like the one dud shade in here. So that's why I didn't give it the full 5 out of 5 for quality. Number 2 is another higher end but indie brand palette. This is the Bili Beauty Eyes of India palette. I discovered this probably close to a year ago now. Is it really that long ago already? This palette, I love that it's so curated. You're getting 10 shades, so it's a little bit smaller than some of these other palettes. But there is so much variety here within these 10 shades. A lot of different directions you could go with this palette. I love the packaging. It's very sleek and just, this palette just makes me happy. In terms of their numeric scores, this was actually tied with my number 1. But the reason why I decided to put this one in second place is A, it is much more expensive than my number 1, and B, there are some of these shadows that you do have to wet. It actually says here, 3 of the shades must be used with a wet brush. That's just how they're meant to be used. So it's kind of like one extra step. I'll usually just spray a brush with some setting spray. Or you could just spray it with water. But that is just kind of like one extra step you have to take in order to use these. So that is why it's not my number 1, but I don't mind having to wet my brush, especially because that's literally how it says they're meant to be used. That is the reason why that one is in second place. That and the price point. Okay, my number 1 palette, if you know my palette collection well, you can probably guess because it's the only one I haven't mentioned yet. But this is my final e.l.f. palette. This is the Earth and Ocean palette. I have really fallen in love with this palette. I haven't even been a big fan of green eyeshadow in the past, but lately I've been playing with this green side over here, and I actually did like an IGTV video doing a look at some of those greens, so if you want to see those in action, check out my Instagram. But I just love that there's so much you can do with this palette. They always seem to nail it with the layout. I love how they have, it's very easy to follow. You have your blues over here, your earthy tones over here, and then some neutrals just in the middle that you could put on either side really. There are a couple of pressed glitters in here, which I know people have mixed feelings on those. I do too. I did email them to ask if those were eye safe, and they told me that they are, but I don't know. Is any glitter really eye safe technically? It's hard to say, but just, yeah, be aware of that. If you hate pressed glitters, you might just want to steer clear of this. I do like using those as kind of like topper shades, but they are different texture-wise. Those are the shades Lagoon and Tundra. They are very different than the other shades in here just as far as their texture goes. I don't think there's a single dud shade in this palette at all. They're all super buttery and pigmented. I love how even these kind of grayish blues, like the shade Abyss right here, actually shows up true to color on your eyes, like this beautiful matte denim blue. I have a feeling those types of shades are very hard to formulate in a way that it does show up true to color, but they did an amazing job. Yeah, I'm obsessed with this palette. It's a very specific color story, but there's so much variety here. You know, you could even go neutral with it if you didn't want to use any color at all. There's some browns and golds in here that you could use for just a basic neutral look. So I just think this is one of the best palettes at the drugstore currently, and out of the 3 e.l.f. palettes, it's my favorite. It's the one that I have the most fun with. But honestly, all 3 of the e.l.f. palettes I've mentioned are really good, so I would just go for the one that speaks to you the most in terms of the color story, because obviously we all have different preferences, and this is a very like subjective ranking that I'm doing here. So, but yeah, the only thing that this did not rank a 5 out of 5 on was packaging, just because I do think the packaging of these is a little bit cheap. It got like a 4 out of 5, but it doesn't bother me at all. This video made me really happy. I love talking about eyeshadow palettes for some reason. You'll notice I did exclude any like quads or duos. I just felt like it was very difficult to compare those to larger palettes, so I decided to leave those out. I don't have very many of those anyway, but those are my updated palette rankings. I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully it gave you an idea of which palettes I would recommend. Honestly, I would recommend all of these just to different people depending on your preferences, so I really don't think any of these are bad palettes per se. Just some are better than others. But that is all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please give the video a thumbs up, and I'd love to have you subscribe and stick around for future videos, and I will talk to you very soon in my next video. Bye.